Okay, I'm going to come at you with three kinds of materials today. One is a PowerPoint. The second is a handout. Did everybody get the handout? Okay, because it's be going over some of that. Here's a couple up here. One is the PowerPoint. The other is the handout, and the third is. Sorry, I can't resist. Give me about 45, 50 seconds and I still won't come up with it. The third will be actually a short segment. We edited down to 5 minutes from a film about Dogen's life that's known as Zen. That I hope many of you have had a chance to see. It's a little bit, I'm not endorsing the film as an accurate biography of Dogen, but it does create some interesting impressions, and I want to zero in on one particular part of Dogen's life that I think the film does an interesting job of highlighting. So, in terms of themes, what I'm primarily trying to do is to bring together 2 points. One is a sense of Dogen coming down to earth and what he represents. Griff did a great job of highlighting Dogen's humor. You know, when you translate Dogen well and you read it the way he reads it, it's funny. I'm reminded of Franz Kafka in that regard because people took him very seriously, and he was kind of a very serious guy. But when he would read some of his writings to his small group of friends, they would break out in hysterical laughter. And I think Dogen, has that side. But Dogen is also known for the stricter side where he's dedicated, he's determined, he won't let obstacles get in the way, and that's an issue I want to kind of play with a little bit. And then I also want to talk about Dogen's poetry and the relationship between his poetry and his prose writings, focusing on a particular episode in his life where it was said that he left his temple in the mountains, Eiheiji, and he went to see the shogun in the town of Kamakura, which was a temporary capital city. That happened in the near the end of his career, and he had direct teachings, they say, with the shogun. And part of his direct teaching was a poem that's become famous because it was highlighted by the Japanese novelist Kawabata Yasunari, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968. And one of the first things he did was in his essay, or in his speech he gave in Stockholm, was to talk about Dogen's poetry, which was very unusual because Dogen was not thought of as a poet, and as William and Griff have pointed out, there's these stereotypical images float around. Dogen is this, Dogen is not that, and yet when we take a closer look, we see the complexity of it. Okay, so taking a look at the handout for a moment. I'm not going to try to cover all of this, but on the last page, on page 4, there's a map that features some of the main temples, the main Zen temples in China that would have been active at the time that Dogen arrived there. But Dogen went to China for about 4 years, beginning in 1223, and he went to a very small segment in China. Conveniently, at the time, the capital city was in the town of Hangzhou, and it was close to the Japan Sea, so he was able to get there. And most of the big Zen temples at that time were taking place in and around the capital city, because Zen was a movement that was supported by the scholar officials and the imperial bureaucracy at the time. And Dogen returned to Japan after 4 years, and he's primarily known for the prose writings. Shobo Genzo is the most famous. Eihei Koloku, Dogen's extended record, is being made more famous by the translation by Dan Layton and Shohaku, if you want to hold that up one more time. Okay. It's a monumental achievement in the field. And as you can see at the bottom of the page, I've outlined the contents of his poetry collection. He wrote over 300 Chinese verses, and what's very interesting there is that he seemed to learn how to follow the Chinese rhyme schemes, which was important for Chinese poetry at the time. So Dogen mastered a lot of kinds of literary activities, the koan literature Griff talks about, and but also the Chinese poetry. He could do it. Whether he's a great poet is another question, but he knew how to do the mechanics of it. He also wrote Japanese poetry known as waka. About 60 of those poems are still with us. And again, he seemed to know how to use some of the literary techniques in those poems. Flipping to the bottom of page 3, I also threw in here a poem by Muso Soseki, just because I just came across this recently. And Muso was known as one of the great Japanese Rinzai teachers of that medieval era of Japanese history, sometime after Dogen, but in the general medieval period. And it's interesting because this is a case where Muso uses Dogen's term, or a term associated with Dogen, Genjo Koan, not Dogen's term, but we largely associate with him in the 4th line. That I've translated here as the koan case that is right in front of us. Although there's various ways of translating that. But that kind of intrigued me. I will be talking about some other aspects, but let's go to the first page of the handout. And here, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I just wanted to highlight an issue that comes up in terms of the complexity of Dogen, whereby there's a famous quote in one of his writings that's been translated. There's a couple versions of translations, Shobogenzo Zui Monki, where he says the composition of literature, Chinese poetry, and verse is worthless. And a lot of people quote a line like that and say, well, Dogen hated literature and poetry, but then he writes several hundred poems, and generally has a very literary style in his prose writings as well. And so I quoted a couple of the poems, one Chinese poem and 2 Japanese waka-style poems that highlight this issue of tension. And one of the questions that came up was referring to that words can express or display but not exhaust the truth. So let's keep on speaking, but you have to know the language game that is appropriate, as the previous lecture showed us. Okay, so I want to keep the poetry in mind, and that he wrote poems, but primarily he did write the prose. And what's the relation, and why did he pick one style as opposed to the other style? So keeping that issue in mind, let's turn to Dogen's biography for a few moments. Teiho Kenzeki Zue is a very interesting and important body of writing about Dogen that was created at different times in history. The Kenzeki, which literally means the record of Kensei, and Kensei was an abbot of a Heiji in the 1400s, is, for the Japanese scholars, considered the standard biography of Dogen. Unfortunately, it's 200 years after Dogen died, so how reliable it is a question, and there's a lot of different versions of it, and the scholars today have lined up 5 different versions, and you can see some have variations. So we have to consider that. But one of the things about the Kenzeki is that it tells the whole story of Dogen from birth to death, and it also includes his Japanese poetry collection, and it kind of highlights the importance of poetry for understanding his life work. Now the Teiho Kenzeki was a later development that came several centuries later. It came in the Edo period. It came with a monk named Menzan, who was one of the leaders in kind of resurrecting and re-editing and putting forward Dogen's writings in the 1700s. And what Menzan did was took the Kenzeki and then took all the other stories you could find, all the other anecdotes you could find about Dogen's life, and some of the famous stories about Shinjin Datsulaku, dropping off body-mind, and his enlightenment experience, and many other stories, and put them all together in one book. The sense of authenticity kind of dissolves a little bit because he's throwing a lot into this work, but it makes it very interesting. And we have in one piece of literature a lot of the ideas that we can form about what Dogen's life may have been like. And then we had Zue. Zue refers to images or woodblock prints, floating world style art that was added to it. This was in the first decade of the 1800s. And that made it more accessible to the non-monastics, the lay people who wanted to learn about it, because you had that visual imagery. And then Around the time of Dogen's 800th birth anniversary in 2000, Eiheiji and the Soto sect put out versions of the Zue portion of it that highlighted the visual imagery, and there were a couple of paperback editions of that. So again, it made it accessible to us 200 years after the original Zue was added onto the Teiho Kenzeki. So here's an example. Well, no, first let me go back to the issue of Dogen's travel. So the upper map shows that in his 20s he went from China to from Japan to China, and supposedly gained enlightenment at Mount Tiandang, where his teacher Ru Jing was the master. And the enlightenment would have taken place in 1225, and then he returned to Japan around the time Ru Jing was dying a couple of years later. The lower map shows his travels within Japan. Born in Kyoto, and then he sets up a temple in Kyoto when he's about 30 years old, a couple of years after he gets back from China. Then that temple's actually in a little town called Fukatsu, which means deep grass, and at that time was kind of an exotic countryside place outside of Kyoto. Now it's just a suburb and town. And then he left Fukatsu to build a Heiji temple in 1243 and stayed there for about 10 years until he died, and returned to Kyoto one more time for medical help at the age of 53. But he does take a 6-month trip to Kamakura, apparently at the request of the shogun, known as Hojo Tokiyori, and with the assistance of his one-eyed samurai patron, known as Hatano Yoshishige, when he's 47. And he stays there for about 6 months, and then decides to return to the mountains. So to put a context into that, I picked out some examples of the Zue images that have been republished recently. This is Dogen as a young man making shuke, that is home leaving, and when he first departs to become a monk on Mount Hiei outside of Kyoto. This is his travel to China. He would have been on the ships that landed in the town of, that's now known as Ningbo, which is across the bay from Shanghai and down the road a bit from the capital city of Hangzhou, what was the capital at the time. And there's a famous story about how Dogen stayed on the ship for a while. Either he didn't have the proper credentials, visa to get into China. That was a complicated story because he hadn't taken all the precepts that were required to credentialize him, or he was sick, he had diarrhea, was another version that you see of that story. But he stayed on the ship for a few weeks until he disembarked and went to visit a number of temples there, and then eventually got enlightened. Okay, this is the famous enlightenment experience. Ru Jing is scolding the monk next to Dogen, who instead of having single-minded meditation, had single-minded slumber and had fallen asleep while meditating. Dogen is stunned by that and visits Ru Jing's chamber that evening, and Ru Jing confirms his enlightenment as Shinjin Datsulaku, dropping off body mind. When Dogen returned from China, there were a couple of miraculous episodes that took place. According to this one, he ran into a typhoon on the way back, and what's known as the one-leaf cannon or guanyin appeared before him and saved him from the treachery of that storm.